Hello everyone, welcome back to Weston the Historian. So I don't have a script today, so I'm going to just jump straight into it. I think Nine Inch Nails is mid. I think they're overrated. I know that's a hot take. I know people love Nine Inch Nails. People think the Downward Spiral or whatever it's called is like the best album like to ever exist ever. And people think Trent Reznor is like greatest musician to ever live ever. It's just not true. It's just not true. I personally, and these are my personal opinions, I think his voice is just so annoying. His voice is so annoying, and their music is so formulaic, and honestly, it's just boring. It's just boring. And I've listened to whole albums, I've listened to all their EPs, and I'm just not amazed. It's just boring to me. It's so boring. And also, Johnny Cash's cover of Hurt is just so much better than the original. Like, it's like not even comparable. Like, it's so much better than the original. And I don't know. I find their music very boring. So, all of that out of the way, I am going to first give a very brief history of industrial music. Very brief and very, you're not going to probably get a lot. You're probably going to see better videos about history of industrial music. But I'm going to give a very brief one, and then I'm going to tell you my top 10 personal favorites. So, starting off, we go back to the 70s. We could honestly go back even further. But starting off in the 70s, this group of people come together and they form TG. I don't want to say the actual name because it's inappropriate, or inappropriate for YouTube. I'll say it. Throbbing Gristle. Strange name. So I'm going to just call them TG. So TG gets together and they create what is considered to be the first industrial band. They start making very strange, experimental, kind of electronic music. They experiment with instruments in a way that no one has ever done. They use things that aren't really instruments as instruments, and that inspired people to create what is now called industrial music. So industrial music basically is just music that is supposed to sound mechanical, almost robotic, factory like, industrial, you know. And sometimes this uses repetition, and it uses electronic noise, and it uses strange vocal styles and strange instruments. Now, of course, it doesn't actually have to use any of those, but it can, and it usually does. And there are some types of industrial music that don't sound exactly like that, but generally speaking, industrial music is supposed to sound mechanical. It's supposed to sound industrial. Usually it's electronic. Usually there's instruments that aren't really instruments being used. Usually they'll use repetition or really strange riff styles or just strange sounds that aren't typical in most other genres of music. So, all that out of the way, I've defined industrial music. I told you what the first industrial band was, all the way back in the 70s. They ended up inspiring other bands like Cabaret Voltaire. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which, eventually led to SBK and Einzelsen Neubauten and Test Department. And then eventually, if you go down the line, you have people combining that with metal, and you get Godflesh, and you get Ministry, and you get, eventually Nine Inch Nails and Rob Zombie and whatnot. But also you get bands like Skinny Puppy. So anyway, very brief history, which, you probably didn't get a lot out of that. It was very confusing. But that's not really the point of today's video. The point of today's video is I'm telling you what bands to listen to. So, this is in no particular order, but I have my 10 favorites. I have some honorable mentions, but I'm going to just tell you my 10 personal favorites. This is not in a particular order, but starting off, we have Ministry. Ministry is one of my favorites because they have done so much with their sound. They have done, starting off, Ministry made pop music. That was their first album. Their first album was pop music, and they released a bunch of pop singles. Some of my favorites are All Day, Effigy, Every Day is Halloween. Those are great songs. Revenge, they were very 80s pop sound. They sounded like Depeche Mode. They sounded like Duran Duran. They didn't sound industrial, really. But eventually, the Twitch album comes out, and that they finally start getting this more industrial sound. They take their pop sound and they start moving in this weirder direction, in this more experimental, more industrial direction. And eventually their third album comes out, and they're full on industrial, and they're mixing it with these crazy guitar riffs, and they're one of the earliest industrial metal bands. And then their fourth album, The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, that comes out, and they start using actual guitars. And their third album, they mostly relied on like samples of guitars, but on their fourth album, they have real guitarists and all this stuff. And they start making all of this cool music. And down the line, they start experimenting with sludge metal. They start experimenting with weird types of industrial metal. They start experimenting way more. And I think Ministry is just such an awesome band. And I think Al Jorgensen, like the frontman of Ministry, and one of the few consistent members of Ministry, is just such an interesting, amazing musician. He's made so much music, even outside of Ministry, some of which I will be talking about as well, because I actually think his outside projects are just so awesome. But anyway, before I keep just ranting about Ministry, I'm going to just move on to my second one, Skinny Puppy. I think Skinny Puppy is awesome. They're not industrial metal. They are just like a more electronic, dancey, kind of gothy, post-punk sort of sound. So I find Skinny Puppy just such an interesting and awesome band. And I think one of my few and biggest regrets is not just going to their live concert, because last year they were on their final tour and I just didn't go. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. It's because they weren't in the area and I didn't really want to fly out, but I deeply regret that. I wish I had flown out of the state. You know, I might have gone all the way to like Georgia or Texas or something like that, but I honestly think that would have been better, you know, because I wish I had seen them live, because their live performances, you can see them on YouTube, they're crazy and they're amazing, and I think that would be awesome. And I think their music is awesome. The one thing I will say is that it took me a minute to get into them. I listened to Assimilate and I was like, oh, this is a good song. And then I listened to their other stuff and I was like, I don't know about this. But eventually I was like, okay, this is pretty awesome. But it took me a minute to really get into them. But now I think they're one of my favorite bands of all time. So anyway, moving on, we have Godflesh. Godflesh is actually considered one of the first industrial metal bands. What I find so interesting about Godflesh is they are just one of the heaviest bands I've ever listened to. I mean, they were in the early 80s creating music which is just crazy heavy, and it's so blunt, and it's crazy because the kind of metal they were making was like when glam metal was popular, which is just insane to me. And I don't know, like you have all of these other bands with like these crazy guitar solos and all this stuff. Godflesh didn't care about that. And they didn't even have a real drummer. It's amazing to me how much music they made, because it was two dudes. It was a guitarist and a bassist. And the guitarist also did the vocals, but it was like they just two dudes and they used a drum machine and stuff like that. And it's amazing how much music they put out with that and how just heavy of a sound they had. And I find it even more interesting because they were very ordinary looking people. If you look at them, it's not like they have crazy makeup. It's not like they have all this tattoos and all these piercings and this crazy outfits. They're very ordinary looking. It's just genuinely heavy music, and I think it's amazing. So, anyway, moving on. We have Front 242. I don't really have a whole lot to say. I just like their music a lot. I'm not as familiar with Front 242 as I am a lot of these other bands on the list. I just felt like I needed to mention them because they were supposedly the first EBM band, which is electronic body music. It's basically just a mix of electronic dance music and industrial. And I think, you know, as far as I remember, Front 242 is considered the first band to really do that. And if I recall correctly, they actually coined the term. And I think they're just great. I love their music. So anyway, moving on, we have Revco. This was one of Al Jorgensen from Ministry, his projects, projects, which he actually worked with one of the members of Front 242 when creating this. And I just think Revco is amazing. Their real name is very inappropriate, but I think their music is just so great. It's really fun. I don't. That's not a term that he used for a lot of the bands on this list. Like their music is fun. Like you can dance to it, and it's like you can laugh at it because it's ridiculous. It's over the top. But anyway, next band, Frontline Assembly. Once again, I don't have a whole lot to say about them. Despite their name, they're, as far as I recall, not really related to Front 242 in any way. But I just like their music. I don't have a whole lot to say. You know, they've done a lot with their sound. They've made EBM, they've made techno, they've made industrial metal, and I think they're a good band. I like them. Next one is Fetus. Strange, out there, very out there, especially on this list. I don't think there's a whole lot of other bands or artists that sound the way Fetus does, but what I find interesting about them is it was actually just one guy who would constantly change the name of the band, and he took on these crazy stage personas, and he pretended that it was a whole band and not just him, which is very an odd tactic. But you know, I I think that Fetus under his name was J.G. Thurwell. I think he's just a phenomenal musician. He's put out so much just amazing and interesting, you know, just music, and it's I don't know. I think some of the best industrial albums come from this guy. So, next one, Swans. Swans are a weird one because they've done a lot of music that is not industrial at all, but they're one of my favorite bands, so I felt the need to mention them. Swans has made, they started off making this heavy, crazy industrial sound. They've moved in like neo folk directions, post punk, they've made it like post rock, they've made all this crazy stuff. Very experimental band, but I just think their sound is amazing. And I think their industrial, I think all of their music is worth checking out. But a lot of their industrial stuff I just find really awesome sounding. Next up, getting close to the end, Killing Joke. I think Killing Joke is one of the most underrated bands just in general ever. They've inspired so many bands, like countless bands. They inspired probably like whatever your favorite rock band is, they've probably heard of Killing Joke, which is strange because no one has heard of Killing Joke, but I think they're one of the best bands ever. I think they're severely underrated. They, you know, their first album, fantastic, and I think a lot of their music is fantastic. They eventually started making more like post punk, new wave kind of sounding stuff, and I think that is their music, even their more poppy stuff, is amazing. I think their song Love Like Blood is one of the best. I genuinely think it's one of the best songs ever written, and I don't say that lightly. I think it is one of the best songs ever written. I think Killing Joke is an amazing band and definitely worth checking out. So, finally on the list, we have Eins zu Sende Neubauten. I have struggled to get into them, but I finally started like really warming up to their sound. And I think they're just an amazing band. One of my all-time favorite songs is Bluma. I think it's beautiful, it's enchanting, it's kind of strange, and I just think it's so awesome. And I think they have such a strange style of music. It's so out there, it's so bizarre, but they're so fascinating because unlike a lot of these bands on the list, they took the term industrial very literally. They literally use pieces of equipment, industrial stuff. They use jackhammers, they use shopping carts, they use random stuff that they just found as instruments. And I just find that so interesting. And they like have created their own instruments. I find that interesting. And they just released a new album, and it's not my favorite, but it's still good. It's worth listening to. But I think they're a great band. I think all of these bands are great. But there's some others I just did not mention, so I'm going to go down my list. I also like Nitzer Ebb, My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, who got a pretty cool scene in The Crow. Let's see, and we've got SBK. I mentioned them earlier, but I think they're amazing, and I really like them, but they didn't make the top 10. But Current 93, Coil, Test Department, those are some other bands I just really like in this genre. So, all of that being said, please subscribe and don't listen to Nine Inch Nails. I'm just joking. Listen to whatever you want, but I don't love Nine Inch Nails. Goodbye, everyone. Subscribe.